Carnguwch church, another church established by St Bino in the 7th century. And where it is established, flat land above a river, would have been a special sacred site for hundreds of years. In fact, in the prehistoric times, there would always have been somewhere sacred here. I've seen many little harebells on the Pilgrim's Way, very beautiful little flowers. The church was in a sorry state when Edward Hyde visited it in 1809. He was doing a survey of all the churches around, and he said this was in the worst state he'd ever seen. So he did begin to renovate it, and indeed it was continued to be used for worship, but it was closed during the 1930s. But the church and the graveyard around it is still being maintained by the local farmers around, who have been living here, some of them, for generations upon generations. It's part of their heritage. So they do what they can to keep the church watertight and weatherproof, and the graveyard tidy for the families who still have their loved ones buried up here, and for the people who visit it as a pilgrimage even today. This is a double-decker pulpit. The bottom seat is where the bell ringer would sit. He had a long pole with a feather on one end and a spike on the other. Men who fell asleep would get a sharp poke. Women were tickled with the feather if they fell asleep. A Sunday school was held here at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and then when the vicar came to preach his sermon at 11 o'clock, the children were expected to sit still and listen to it. But what happened was that some of the adults decided to bring the children to Sunday school and then go. So the vicar at the time got rather fed up with having to look after the children. And in the end, a chapel was built in the village, and there was a quarrel, and so the Sunday school in the end ended up in the chapel. St Bino's church, Pistyll, is said to be the last resting place of Bino, for he founded this church in the 6th century when he would come here for some peace and quiet away from the hustle and bustle of Carnguwch. It's built of the local stone with a slate roof and a simple bellcot. And originally there wouldn't have been any windows in the nave because the congregation were illiterate and therefore wouldn't have needed light to see to read. There's a squint window in the north wall because the sick people were housed some way away in a hospice, and then they would come to see the Mass through the squint window. All that remains of the early church is a large stone on the south-east corner of the church. This field is called Eisteddfa, a perfect place for pilgrims to sit and rest on their journey. Pilgrims would have found refreshment at the wells along the wayside, such as the one behind me. We have to rely on our water bottles. St Mary's Well here in Nefyn was built by the Victorians to provide water for the people and the animals, and you can still hear a trickle of it, but the original St Mary's Well is somewhere else. Most of the pilgrim path followed the coastline, so they would always be in sight and sound of the sea, which they would have to cross to get to Bardsey Island. The pilgrims wouldn't have had a handy bench to sit on, a rest and be thankful bench. They'd have had to find a rock or whatever they could to take their rest.